Welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show on 94.7 The Pulse. Music, interviews, news, and, well, Two Blokes Chatting. Now, here are the two blokes.
Tell you who's been around for the long run is our next guest, and at 7 minutes past 10 o'clock, why don't you tell us who it is, Ross?
I will. I'm delighted to have him back. I reckon this is the 10th or 12th time he's been good enough to give up his time. When I first met him way back in Winchelsea in about 2007 or 8 at the Sportsman of the Year Award, and he's been very gracious with his time. And again this morning, David Parkin, good morning and welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show.
Thanks, Rob. It has been a blast. I started to think about when we did meet that Sportsman's Night, I think it was, and it's been a good friendship relationship since. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thoroughly enjoy it, and thought it was time to get you back to have a look at the year that was in the game. There's a lot has happened. There's a lot has changed. There's certainly the phenomenon of the women's footy, which has really taken over, culminated in their grand final last week. Let's start in that patch. Have you watched that game develop with great interest and enjoyment?
Yeah, I was pretty disappointed with the standard and the quality of the game they played, a couple of years ago. I think there's been an absolute dramatic improvement in all elements of the game by the girls. They certainly got themselves fitter. They're running harder. They're competing. I think they're getting used to using their bodies correctly and looking after themselves, I think, in terms of the collisions, etc. And I think now the interest, I know it's being talked about by males now in a way that they weren't, some couple of years ago. But the game now is I think, enjoyable to play. It's a good standard. It's a fierce, contested game. And I think those who are watching are enjoying it for the same reasons.
Good morning, David. It's Neil here. I think one of the other things we've observed, Rob and I have been involved in calling women's footy on the radio since even before the AFLW was there. And
right.
In those days, we had Renee Gehring coming across from netball. Tamara Luke was a cyclist. Kate Darby was a basketballer. I suspect a lot of the girls coming through now, particularly in the sort of first, second, third year players, have only ever played footy, and I guess that's contributing to the skills.
Yeah, look, it's a terrific thing. My grandkids had a crack at the first off, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. Sadly, both got injuries which interfered with their lives for some time, and that, I think, has been a crucial element. I think the girls now are probably fitter, stronger, more aware in terms of how to use their bodies and protect themselves. I think there's a fair bit more of that. So I think, as we've all seen, the standard has dramatically, in my opinion, improved, and I can sit and watch it now. I'm not going much to the AFL men's game either, but I can certainly sit and watch it on television. The grand final was a ripper, high quality, close, and Brisbane coming from behind that stage. I think they've been the better team and probably deserved to win, but it was a really exciting finish to the season as well.
David, change your tack a little. Influences on the game. You've certainly been one of them. I know you're very modest about it, but we observe that as a statement of fact. We had a period where Tommy Hafey's influence produced a lot of coaches at the highest level, and we're now seeing, after the AFL Grand Final this year with Craig McRae coaching, the Lee Matthews influence. Now, you had a fair bit to do with Lee as a youngster. You would know him well, and his ability that seems to have affected other people and their passion for the game and their skill for coaching. Is Lee now up with some of the greats as being a genuine influence on the game, not just as a player?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. It's funny because Lee and I have very little in common. When he first came and I coached and played with him, he'd sneak off without even changing his clothes and go back down the beach where he lived. And wasn't, terribly gregarious with the rest of the group. He's now become one of my, closest mates, and totally different personality. You mightn't like me saying this, but a totally different personality to the one that I first met as a young kid, with kids at whatever he was, 20 years of age, had a couple of children, etc. I read his book, his biography, the first time only about a year ago. It is the best, and I'm a biography reader. I'm reading the one on John Coleman at the moment and thoroughly enjoying that too, although it's fairly detailed. But that's all I do is read biography. I'm a bit strange, I suppose. When I read his, which he wrote totally himself, it is him, not somebody else talking about him and writing about him. It is Lee giving us an insight into who he was as a person first and foremost, and then as a player, and then finally as a coach, and now as a spokesperson for the game. He's been the greatest development in a human being that I know of, who's certainly made an impact in the broadest sense in helping Australian football be where it is today. And I think that what you're saying now is great, because it's an acknowledgement that some people just don't understand. But I think you are absolutely right. His impact on the game, it's in the, Kevin Sheedy class. I think those two in 50 years' time and beyond my lifetime and some others, they'll be, both of those will be remembered in the same way as Ronald Dale Barassi has been remembered in the last 6 months or so. And Lee is, as you know, where if you can get him in a conversation or interviewing him, etc., you get insights that very few other people can give you into what's happening in the game. So I'd agree with you totally.
I think the other thing with Lee Matthews is, yes, outstanding player, clearly an outstanding coach, but one of the other roles that a lot of people, and media person, the other role that he plays that a lot of people don't sort of acknowledge is the fact he's also a director at Brisbane, on the board of the Brisbane Lions as well. So all that stuff around the development of the game in and around Brisbane and actually running the club, he does that as well. It's quite an extraordinary contribution, isn't it?
Yeah, when you think in those broad terms, there are only half a dozen in my lifetime. Whitten and Barassi and Matthews and Sheedy, and there are a handful of them who have had a massive impact not only on their club but in the broader sense on the game itself. And young Hocking, I think in his own way, when the game had run into a bit of a headwind and we were seeing more marks or more catches of the ball in the corner in rugby than we were in Australian football. The long kick had disappeared. We were just keepings off, as we do in hockey or soccer or any other game. We just keep it off the opposition. And I think Stephen Hocking's workshops had a phenomenal influence on the decision made, which now sees, look, I hate the idea of putting a person out of the game, standing a person on the mark and they're on the ground and they can't participate. I'm totally opposed to that in a sense, but I have to admit that as a key input has allowed people to take the ball on, run with it, kick it long. We're now getting spectacular high marks in the numbers that we were getting before, and the long kicking is the one thing that takes our game into a world other than any other sport in a real sense, and to have those two inputs, on front of stage again now, I'm absolutely wrapped and have enjoyed, really enjoyed the year, I suppose, with Carlton. Have a bit of an interest there, obviously, but with Carlton and Collingwood being around at the finish, two clubs that have struggled really to get the success that I'm not sure whether they deserve, but everybody expected to, but they haven't. And to have those two, you're quite right about the coaches. I've mentored Pate McRae, and when he was at Hawthorn, I loved him as a person. I thought he'd never make a senior coach because he's too nice a boy and couldn't. He might be able to point the gun, but he'd never fire the bullet. I thought you can't survive as a coach. Well, how wrong I am. The two or three coaches at the moment that are leading the way are all quality people in their own way, not ranters and idiots like people like me in the past, autocratic dictatorial pricks as they were. But we're finding
allegedly.
Well, people quite reasonable. Yeah, it's funny. I had lunch yesterday with 4 or 5 of my old players like Michael Sexton, etc., and you suddenly realise that the impact I had wasn't as a coach. I don't think I made them any better as footballers, etc. But I had this very powerful belief in the balanced lifestyle. And when you sit down with David Glascott and Michael Sexton and a couple of others yesterday, and you realise that the impact wasn't to make them better footballers, but you hope better people, and more importantly, to live a life other than football when football was finished and get the satisfactions that football were giving them. And that's been one of the sad things, as you know, of my great argument in the game, is that we've done the research that shows that if you do have your head into something else other than your football in a sincerely committed way, then you actually play better football. What we don't know, and we've got this terrible problem we're facing right now with the large group of ex-players who are now suing the league for the effects of their concussion, etc. The reality is that just about every one of those, and I maybe shouldn't say this publicly, but every one of those has never made the transition correctly from the finish of their game into a life that was able to lead them to a reasonable income and satisfaction, etc. they're getting from football. And I think that's been a disaster. And at the moment, the league have not done. Well, I think the research money's run out, but there's been some difficulties in that area. They just haven't now followed up to see, did you, if you prepared properly, make a good transition to life after football or not? And that's, I think, a crucial piece of evidence which we don't have, and I'm one that's been batting very hard to see if we can get the research board of the AFL to complete that, and will give us some insight into what clubs need to be doing. That's why Geelong they've been the most successful club by a country mile in terms of games won or lost over the last 10 years. And they've been the only club in the last 10 years who have had 2 males and 2 females working as support for non-football activities to their playing group. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. Their success, I know people argue about the premiership run. I won a premiership last year, or whatever it was, the last one they won. And but in games won and lost, they kill it. And I think they're one of the better ones in terms of transitioning players into life after football, because they've carefully developed the whole person while they've been at the club, not just as a footballer and then thrown them out the door. That's been my, as I'm always on when I get on your show, I always talk about this as one of the crucial elements of the game, which quite sadly we haven't done nearly as well as AFL, who claims to be the most professional and the best sport in the country and stand up against anything in the world. We're certainly not as good as we should be in the life after for Australian footballers.
David, I was going to go down this path in this chat, but I want to go back to the Lee Matthews circumstance, because it was clear that as a youngster, he seemed disconnected with what the game was really about. He was just good at it and he knew it and he played accordingly. But then there was a stage in his career when he must have realised that, no, the game's more important than that. And he then, as a character, changed, and you mentioned that earlier. And then he started to then influence others to the point that they are now living very successful and performing very successfully. Is it just that understanding of the simplicity of it? Because Lee Matthews to me is just been so simple. He speaks in a way that's easy to understand. The game is a simple game. Coach it simply, play it simply, but then you've got to have life around it. And he, to me, is now head and shoulders above the others that you've mentioned, the Sheedies of the world that maybe, Kevin got a bit lost there for a while, but Lee Matthews is just about keep it simple, play accordingly, and then be a good person at the end of it. It's a pretty good plan.
Yeah, and look, I've sort of admired him enormously from the background that he started with. He didn't have an easy entry in the game in a real sense. He struggled with that. He had some quite difficult moments in becoming what I would call integrated into the team. But, 30 years later or whatever it is, he is admired for the very things that you are talking about now. The influences, and the one that you've just mentioned, the influences in Brisbane beyond his playing and coaching period, has been phenomenal. If you can provide clarity of the problem, the first person I would go to now, I used to probably go to John Kennedy in the past, the first person I would go now to have a yarn, place the argument or the problem or the difficulty I have on the table as clearly as I could, I would use his, his suggestions or ideas or thoughts as to how this could be resolved or how you should best go about it. I think of all the people that I know that are, in and around sport and in and around Australian Football League, as you've just described, is the person who is most admired and most appreciated, most respected, I think, of anybody else in the game for the very things that you've said.
And one that you made a passing reference to, and I was going to talk to you about this, during the Ron Barassi Memorial, your image appeared on the TV screen. You were obviously there. It's really hard to put into words, isn't it, just how amazing he was for Australian rules football. You played against him, you coached against him, you probably coached against him when he was playing and vice versa to some extent because he was doing the crossover stuff. How do you sum up a Ron Barassi in a minute or two or three?
Difficult to do, and you won't know that I was a lunatic Melbourne supporter. I've been
I think you told us that, yeah.
Melbourne member since 1949. Ian Ridley was Dad's clerk in the bank. I used to race him after school just to have a conversation with them nights that I could. I met the Melbourne players, got to know Ron Barassi. This is as a supporter, a kid supporter of the club. And fortunately for me, that relationship was retained, firstly as an opposition player, then as an opposition coach, and sitting on the coaches board at the AFL, VFL, AFL under Jack Hamilton. Ron was just, and I'm not sure that I think a fair bit of credit given. It was a magnificent funeral, if you have a magnificent funeral. I thought his son gave the best eulogy I've ever heard in any situation like that. It was just a insight into the man. I didn't even know he had a son, so that shows you how ignorant I was. And Ron, I think, affected the game with all the people we talked about, and Lee Matthews being the modern now to me, Barassi, because Barassi had an influence over so many of the major decisions of the game, both on and off the field. We'd go before, we'd met Jack Hamilton once a year. Ron started that. We'd go for a meal for a couple of hours before we go to VFL headquarters there in Jollymont. And he would have the agenda all set out. He'd have 5 or 6 things which were crucial at that point as to make the game better, better to watch, easier to umpire, more enjoyable to play, exciting to coach, all those sorts of principles he'd apply. And we would go off, having discussed those in length for a couple of hours, we'd go off and put our case via Ron to Jack Hamilton and the whatever they were in those days, the delegates in those days. And he had, as much as Sheeds and Whitten and company and Matthews now, I think Ron had the most significant influence on how Australian football developed to become the great game that we all love today. I think it was a fantastic recognition of that man.
Because you look at Barassi, obviously the moment I guess everyone remembers at Carlton is the half-time to full-time in the 1970 Grand Final, where he basically changed the game in that half of football. He then did what he did at North Melbourne and got them their first premiership. Then he went to Sydney and put Sydney football on the map. Lee Matthews did the same thing in Brisbane in terms of putting footy on the map there. Sheedy did it in Greater Western Sydney. I guess the challenge now, I know it's a different situation because it's already a football state. Who's the current day Barassi, Sheedy, Matthews who goes down to Hobart to establish the Tasmanian side, do you reckon?
Yeah, that's a leading question. Let's hope it does establish, because what's happened so far, and I ran into the ex-premier of the state not so long ago at the airport, and after the half-hour conversation that Peter Hudson and I had with him, I started to think that maybe this has become too late, too difficult. The divisions in the state still complicate the issues. The game has deteriorated dreadfully within the intrastate in terms of what's happening in footy. And I just hope that somehow that those hurdles are going to be met and jumped over. I'm not sure that we need to spend the kind of money that they're talking about to put a stadium up. The stadiums don't need it for the numbers of the state, etc. Less than, I think, about 500,000 people in the state, etc. They're spread all around the joint. It needs two good grounds. The ground in Launceston is a fantastic football ground. It needs a bit done to it, but it could certainly hold games. I'm not so sure. I'm not smart enough. No, I'm not a businessman, business head, etc. But there are a number of people now, like Peter Hudson, who are absolutely committed to getting the best result for the state, who are very anxious about where the political support and the financial support and the AFL support to make sure that the state that's produced some of the most influential people, both on and off the field, to be recognised in the way that you and I would love it to happen. I think it's just terrible that we have a Western Sydney side and we don't have a Tasmanian side. I think it's great that we do have a Western Sydney side, but to have that happen and two in Queensland before we've got one in Tasmania is ludicrous in my opinion.
Yeah, I had a couple of weeks holiday, Tassie, earlier this year, and just talking wherever I went to people down there, and I think this is 20 years too late there. The people aren't engaged, the youth are a bit disengaged. Those that are engaged very much with Hawthorn and or North Melbourne, or have their favourite team that their families followed for years. You're right about the disconnect between north and south of the state. It really does look like a very, very difficult proposition to get it all working. And as I said, I hope I'm wrong, but I reckon they've missed the boat.
Yeah, well, I could use exactly the same words. It's just really sad when an enjoyment, although I think I was the last coach. I coached a Victorian team that got annihilated, and I was invited back to the reunion of that team just a few months ago, and I wish I'd never accepted him. I got absolutely ridiculed by everybody, whether they were on or off the field, but it was a fantastic celebration of that game that I had coaching. The players all came back and had dinners and things, and they played a game, etc. They did it magnificently, raised an enormous amount of money for charity, etc. in the process. But it's sad, isn't it? Because when we talk about footy, we're old enough on twice your ages, and that was so much a part of my life, the Tasmanian, going and recruiting Peter Hudson and spending my Christmas holidays trying to go over there and get him fit, running around the bloody golf course, etc. And that friendship's been fantastic. Pete's one of the better people I've met in my life, and he's doing an incredibly good job both on the group that are trying to establish that in Tassie and the development of the new facility for Hawthorn. That's also on his plate. So he's a very, very good man, Peter Hudson.
One last question, and completely different tack. We've been talking positives. We've had a Collingwood premiership. For some, that's difficult to swallow. It's a sort of a new Collingwood now. But David, I've had the privilege of interviewing two high-profile Collingwood supporters of recent times. I've asked them this question. I'll ask you: is the Collingwood Football Club a better place without Eddie Maguire?
Oh, that's an unfair question. I'm a good mate. I think Eddie's worked extremely hard, but I think probably people might say the same about Jeff Kennett at Hawthorn. But when you get to the point where you're a leader who's an autocrat, and you probably don't, listen as much as you should, make up your mind. I think it has been fantastic what he did in terms of the Brassy, the ceremony we had for his death. There's no better performer in that sense. He was just brilliant in the choice of words and the way he ran that. But it's on results. You might be right. I don't know. It's just people. He's one, isn't it? Where you go, what event you get, Eddie's name comes up in that debate that you're still doing on the list is very, very relevant. But I think in the wash-up, I think he's been a very, very good person, not only for the Collingwood Football Club, but for football in general. And to me personally, he's been fantastic to me. Yeah.
David, thank you so much again. Really appreciate your time. As I said at the start, you have never once said, "No, Rob, I'm too busy, I don't want to talk to you." I really appreciate it, and I'm thrilled to have the word friendship chucked in there, because I feel that has developed, and it's a real privilege for me and Neil to have you on our show. Best wishes. We hope to speak to you again and often. Don't let numbers worry you. I think your head's very clear, very open, and we hope to get more out of it for many years to come.
Thank you, both of you. It's always a joy to come on, and I'm, like you, both of you, we love the game. It's a unique game, and in terms of what it gives to this country, it's at a time when we're being divided by everything. Football has a great capacity, cricket too, I suppose, on the other sense, but has a great capacity to bring Australian people together, not apart. And at this time in our history, I think that's probably a very, very significant thing.
Wise words to finish. David, thank you so much. Best wishes.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, David.